downright creepy experience at a gas station. Imagine this, you're driving alone late at night, rain pouring down, and your gas tank is on empty, dangerously close to running out. You don't want to stop, not out here in the middle of nowhere, but you have no choice. You spot a faint glow ahead and pull into an old, run-down gas station. The flickering lights barely illuminate the lot, the place looks abandoned, but it isn't. You step out of the car, and that's when it begins. What would you do if something, or someone, was waiting for you in the shadows? Story 1. Money was tight, so I picked up a second job working the night shift at a gas station on the edge of town. The hours were long, the customers were sparse, and the nights dragged on in silence except for the occasional hum of cars passing by. It wasn't glamorous, but it helped pay the bills. For the first couple of months, it was uneventful, until a man started showing up regularly that I worked the night shift at a gas station because I was short on cash and needed a second job. I did it for a few months, and by the second or third month, a man started coming in regularly around 2 a.m. He was tall, maybe 6'3", with long, stringy hair and a tattered denim jacket that looked older than me. Every night, he came in at almost the exact same time, 1:30 a.m., and bought a tall can of beer. He never bought gas, just the beer, and he always paid in crumpled bills that smelled faintly of mildew. At first, I thought he was just another drifter passing through, but there was something about him, something unsettling. One night, as I handed him his change, he asked me, "What's your name?" "Tom," I said, keeping it short. He nodded, then repeated my name slowly, like he was tasting it. "Tom," he said, smiling faintly. "I like that. Good name." After that, he came in every night and greeted me the same way, "Hey, Tom." Sometimes he would mumble to himself while staring at the wall, sipping his beer. Other times, he'd just stand by the counter, watching me restock shelves. I tried not to let it bother me. He seemed harmless, odd, but harmless. One night, curiosity got the better of me. As he lingered near the candy aisle, I asked, "What's your name?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Bob." "Bob." It sounded fake, but I didn't press him. I asked if he worked nearby, and he let out a sharp, almost bitter laugh. "Work?" he said, shaking his head. "Not anymore. They screwed me over." I didn't ask who they were. He didn't seem like the type who'd take kindly to questions. Instead, he added, "You're different, though, Tom. You seem like you know what you're doing." I didn't know what to make of that, so I just nodded and went back to cleaning the counter. After that, he left, muttering something under his breath as he walked into the night. A week passed, and Bob stopped showing up. At first, I was relieved. Something about him had always put me on edge. But after a few nights, I started wondering what had happened to him. Maybe he'd found another gas station or moved on to a different town. Then, on a stormy night, the kind where the rain falls in sheets and the thunder shakes the ground, the door chime startled me. I turned to see Bob standing there, but he wasn't the same man I remembered. His hair was plastered to his face, dripping with rainwater, and his jacket was soaked through. His eyes, usually vacant, were wild and darting around the room. "Bob?" I asked cautiously. "You okay?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped inside, leaving muddy footprints on the tile, and stood by the door, staring blankly at the wall. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I need somewhere to stay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. A chill ran down my spine. "Are you in trouble?" I asked. He turned to me, his face pale and his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear? Guilt? "I did something bad," he said, his voice trembling. "What do you mean?" I asked, but he didn't answer. Instead, he walked past me toward the restroom hallway. I heard the door to one of the bathrooms creak open, and then close. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should I call the police? He hadn't done anything to me, but his words, "I did something bad," echoed in my head. Minutes turned into hours, and Bob didn't come out. I assumed he was passed out in the restroom. Then, the lights went out. The entire gas station plunged into darkness, leaving me in silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing down on me. I grabbed the flashlight from behind the counter and made my way toward the back of the store. As I approached the restrooms, I noticed both doors were slightly ajar, and empty. Bob wasn't in either one. That's when I heard it, a faint dripping sound, followed by the squeak of wet shoes on tile. My heart pounded as I swung the flashlight around. "Bob?" I called out, my voice shaking. The squeaking stopped. I turned toward the sound, and my flashlight beam landed on him. He was crouched near the storage room door, his eyes wide and unblinking. Before I could react, he lunged at me, screaming, "You won't take me back." I stumbled, dropping the flashlight as he grabbed at my shirt. I managed to shove him off and bolted for the front of the store. My hands fumbled with my keys as I dashed to my car and locked myself inside. From the safety of my car, I called 911. The police arrived minutes later, their flashing lights cutting through the storm. They found Bob, or rather, Ted, as I later learned, huddled in the storage room, clutching a metal pipe. He didn't resist when they took him away. Later, I found out why he'd been so desperate. Earlier that night, Ted had killed his wife during a fight and had been on the run ever since. He was using the gas station as a temporary hideout, but his guilt, or paranoia, got the better of him. I quit the night shift the next day. No amount of money was worth the kind of fear I felt that night. But sometimes, late at night, when I hear the hum of a car outside my window, I remember his voice, "I did something bad." And I wonder if he remembers me. 42-inch. The highway stretched endlessly into the night, a dark ribbon winding through the middle of nowhere. Mark, exhausted from hours of driving, fought the urge to close his eyes. He'd promised himself he'd stop at the next gas station, but for miles, there had been nothing but barren roads and shadows. Finally, the faint glow of neon cut through the gloom. A gas station appeared on the horizon, its sign blinking irregularly, casting an eerie green hue over the empty lot. relief mixed with unease as Mark pulled in. The place was deserted, except for a single car parked near one of the pumps. It was an old sedan, perfectly clean, the windows gleaming like polished glass. Odd for a place this run down. Mark parked at the next pump and glanced inside the store. A woman stood behind the counter, staring out at him. Her smile was the first thing he noticed, too wide, too perfect. She didn't wave, didn't move, just smiled. He forced himself to look away, blaming his fatigue for the unease prickling at the back of his neck. He walked into the store, the faint chime of the doorbell breaking the silence. The woman's gaze followed him as he approached the counter. Her smile didn't falter. "Long drive?" she asked, her voice light but somehow flat, like it lacked emotion. "Yeah," Mark replied, pulling out his wallet. "Can I get 30 on pump 2? Her head tilted slightly as she took his card, her eyes never leaving his face. "Big trip?" Mark nodded awkwardly. "Something like that." She handed back his card, her hand lingering for a fraction too long. "Drive safe," she said, her lips curling even higher. Mark muttered a thank you and left quickly, the automatic doors hissing closed behind him. He glanced at the lone car again as he walked back to his. It was still empty, its pristine condition standing out against the dusty surroundings. As he opened his car door, something made him turn back toward the store. The woman was standing at the entrance now, watching him. Her smile was wider than before, her teeth unnervingly white under the flickering light. Mark froze. He blinked, and she was gone. His breath quickened as he turned toward his car, his pulse hammering in his ears. But when he looked through the windshield, he stopped cold. The woman was inside his car. She sat in the driver's seat, her hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead. Her face was wrong, stretched, distorted, her eyes too large, her mouth splitting impossibly wide in that same grotesque smile. Mark stumbled back, tripping over his own feet. He spun toward the gas station for help, but through the store window, he saw her again, behind the counter, grinning at him as if nothing had happened. He turned toward the pumps. There she was, standing by the lone car. And in the reflection of his own car's windows, he saw her too, grinning from every angle, her eyes unblinking, the world seemed to tilt. Everywhere he looked, she was there, multiple versions of her, identical, all smiling, all watching. Desperation took over. Mark threw himself into the passenger seat, shoved the keys into the ignition, and started the engine. He floored the gas pedal, speeding out of the lot without daring to look back. The road blurred under his headlights as he drove into the night, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The gas station faded in his rearview mirror, but his heart refused to calm, and then he heard it. A soft laugh. It came from directly behind him. Mark's breath hitched as his eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. He exhaled shakily, shaking his head. "You're just tired," he whispered to himself, but then the laugh came again, louder this time. Mark slammed on the brakes, his car skidding to a halt. He jumped out, leaving the door open as he circled the vehicle, his eyes scanning the dark road. Nothing. He leaned back into the car, his heart pounding. That's when he saw them. Handprints. Wet, dark handprints smeared across the inside of the rear window. Mark's chest tightened as he backed away, his gaze locked on the marks. They were fresh, dripping, and unmistakably human. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. Fumbling, he pulled it out, relief flooding him as he saw the incoming call, his sister, probably checking in. He answered quickly, his voice trembling. "Hello." "Hey, just calling to see if you're okay," she said, her voice calm. Mark opened his mouth to respond but froze as her voice continued, changing. "You look so tired." His blood turned to ice. It wasn't his sister's voice anymore. It was hers. The line went dead, leaving only the faint echo of laughter on the wind. Mark turned to the road, ready to run, but standing under the flickering gas station sign in the distance was the woman. Her smile was waiting for him. Story 3. It all started back in the late 70s when I was just a kid living in Charlotte, North Carolina. My dad, a hard-working mechanic, would drive me to school early in the mornings, and our routine always included a stop at this small, dimly lit gas station on the edge of town. It wasn't much to look at, flickering neon signs, cracked pavement, but it was familiar. Until one morning, it wasn't. We arrived before dawn, the sky still painted with shades of black and gray. The station looked deserted. The lights were on, but the lot was eerily quiet. My dad honked the horn a few times, expecting the attendant to shuffle out like he always did. Nothing. The silence hung heavy, and something about it didn't sit right. After a moment, he muttered, "Stay here," and got out of the car to check. I watched him disappear into the store, my stomach twisting with a feeling I couldn't explain. When he came back, his face was tense. "Nobody's there," he said, climbing back into the truck. Without another word, we drove off, leaving that unsettling scene behind. 2 days later, my dad was reading the paper at breakfast when his expression changed. "That gas station, it's in the news," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. He handed the paper to my mom, but I caught enough of the headline, "Gas station attendant found stabbed to death." The police believed it was a robbery, but the details were scarce. Dad quietly folded the paper and said, "We're not stopping there again." And we didn't. But I couldn't stop wondering, what if he had found the body that morning? Or worse, what if the killer had still been there, waiting? That gas station burned itself into my memory, a dark place I never wanted to see again. Story 4. Because of my work, I usually fill up on gas on weekends, but this time, it wasn't broad daylight, and it wasn't a crowded stop along the main road. It was a lonely, rainy autumn night, the kind where the world feels muted, except for the relentless drumming of rain against metal and pavement. The gas station was small, tucked away off a quiet stretch of highway, surrounded by towering trees that swayed ominously in the storm. Its neon sign buzzed faintly, the light flickering like it might give out at any moment. I should have kept driving, but the fuel gauge was dangerously low. I had no choice. As I pulled into the station, the tires splashed through puddles, and the dim overhead lights cast eerie shadows that stretched and wavered in the rain. I stepped out of the car, the cold wind biting through my jacket, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and decaying leaves. The air felt heavy and oppressive. As I grabbed the nozzle and slid my card into the slot, a chill ran down my spine. That's when I noticed him. At first, he was nothing more than a dark shape at the pump next to mine, motionless under the dim light. He wore a hood that obscured most of his face, and there was no car beside him, just an empty pump. He wasn't moving, wasn't even pretending to do anything. He was just standing there, facing me. I swallowed hard, pretending not to notice. But my heart was pounding, my instincts screaming at me. Something was wrong. I focused on the pump, the sound of fuel rushing into the tank roaring in my ears. Then he moved, a single, deliberate step closer. "You out here alone?" he asked, his voice low and rough like gravel scraping against metal. I forced myself to respond, my voice steadier than I felt. "No. My husband's in the car." It was a lie, but I turned to glance at the back seat, hoping the gesture might sell it. The man tilted his head, studying me like a predator deciding how much effort the hunt was worth. "Funny," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Didn't see him." My stomach churned. He took another step, and now I could see his face, sharp angles, sunken eyes that glinted with malice, and a thin, humorless smile that didn't reach those eyes. His gaze flicked to the umbrella in my passenger seat, then back to me, as though assessing every detail, every possible move I could make. I yanked the nozzle out of the tank, gas splattering onto the wet pavement, and turned to him, holding my car keys like a makeshift weapon. "Back off," I snapped, trying to sound braver than I felt. He didn't flinch. Instead, his smile widened. He leaned in closer, and I caught a glimpse of something glinting in his hand, a knife. "You really think he's gonna save you?" he said, nodding toward my car, his voice mocking, taunting. "Or maybe you're just lying," panic surged through me. My mind raced as I threw open the car door and grabbed the umbrella. I swung it wildly, forcing him to take a step back. For a split second, I thought he might retreat, but instead, he reached out and slammed the door shut before I could get inside. "You've got fight, good," he said, almost laughing. "It makes this more fun." Adrenaline took over. I lunged for the door handle, shoving it open with all my strength. He stumbled back just enough for me to dive into the driver's seat. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, he slammed his hand against the window, his face inches from the glass. His smile was gone now, replaced by a look of pure rage. I didn't hesitate. I threw the car into reverse, the tires squealing as I swerved to avoid him. But just as I sped out of the lot, my headlights caught him again. He stood in the middle of the road, holding something up, a gas nozzle, the hose still attached, fuel spraying onto the pavement. He struck the nozzle against the ground, sparks flying, and my breath caught in my throat. I didn't wait to see if he'd ignite it. The highway felt endless as I drove, my chest heaving, every muscle tense. What if the car broke down? What if he was following me? I couldn't stop looking in the mirrors, half expecting to see headlights bearing down on me. By the time I reached my driveway, I was shaking so badly that I could barely park the car. I stepped out into the rain, my legs weak, and froze. Scratched into the driver's side door, deep and jagged, was a single word, liar. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't stop seeing his face, his eyes, the knife, the sparks. He hadn't just been dangerous, he'd been waiting for someone like me. And I'll never forget the way he looked at me like he already knew how it would end if we ever crossed paths again. Story 5. Emily's first night at the gas station began like any other mundane shift. She arrived a little before midnight, the rain pattering softly against the roof of her car as she pulled into the empty lot. The station stood alone on the edge of a wooded area, its flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow across the puddles on the asphalt. Her trainer, Carl, was supposed to meet her to show her how to handle the night shift, but as she parked and glanced around, there was no sign of him. His car was parked in its usual spot near the side of the building, but the store lights were dim, and the place seemed deserted. Emily hesitated before stepping out, the cold air biting at her skin as she made her way to the door. The lock clicked open easily with the key Carl had left for her during orientation, and she stepped inside. The store was quiet, too quiet. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerators and the faint buzz of the overhead lights. She called out, "Carl. You here?" Her voice echoed slightly, but there was no response. Brushing off her unease, Emily assumed he must have stepped out for a break or was in the back storage room. She'd just settle in and wait for him. She set her bag down behind the counter and began to familiarize herself with the register, occasionally glancing at the glass doors, expecting him to stroll in at any moment. Time dragged. Midnight came and went, and Carl was still nowhere to be found. By 12:30 a.m., her concern began to grow. She checked the small storage room behind the counter, but it was empty. The back door was locked from the inside, and there were no signs of movement anywhere. She even peeked into the restroom and walked around the perimeter of the building, but there was nothing, no footprints in the mud, no cigarette butts, nothing to indicate Carl had been outside. The only thing she found was his phone, left on the counter behind the register, its screen dark and lifeless. Emily's unease deepened. Why would he leave his phone behind? And where could he have gone? Her nerves started to fray as the night wore on. The occasional car would pull into the lot, its headlights briefly illuminating the store, but none of the customers noticed anything strange. They came in, bought their snacks or gas, and left, completely oblivious to the tension gnawing at her. By 2 a.m., Emily decided to call the store owner. She hated to bother him so late, but something felt wrong. The line rang several times before Mr. Porter answered, his voice groggy. "Emily. What's wrong?" "Hi, Mr. Porter," she began hesitantly. "I think something's happened. Carl never showed up for the shift, but his car is here, and..." "Wait," Porter interrupted. "Carl's car is there?" "Yes," she replied, glancing nervously toward the dark parking lot. It's been here since I arrived, but I haven't seen him all night. His phone is still on the counter. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Porter spoke again, his tone sharp and urgent. Emily, don't leave the store. Lock the doors and stay inside. I'm coming over. The call ended abruptly, leaving Emily with a sinking feeling in her stomach. She did as she was told, locking the front doors and pulling down the blinds, though she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every creak of the building made her jump, and she found herself glancing at the security monitors more often than not. That's when she noticed something odd. The monitor showing the storage room flickered slightly, the image distorted. She leaned closer, narrowing her eyes at the grainy footage. The room was empty, but there was a faint shadow in the corner, something that didn't seem to belong. It wasn't moving, but it was there, a dark smudge against the pale walls. Her pulse quickened. Had someone been in the store this whole time? She hesitated, unsure whether to investigate or wait for Mr. Porter. Her curiosity won out. Grabbing the flashlight from under the counter, she crept toward the storage room, her footsteps eerily loud in the silence. The door to the storage room creaked as she pushed it open. The light from her flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating shelves stocked with cleaning supplies and extra inventory. The shadow she'd seen on the monitor was gone, though the room felt colder than it should have. She stepped inside, scanning the corners carefully, but there was nothing there, just a faint smell of damp concrete and oil. As she turned to leave, something caught her eye. The floor near the back wall was scuffed as if something heavy had been dragged across it. Emily knelt down, running her hand over the marks, and noticed a faint seam in the floor, a trapdoor. Her stomach turned. She hadn't been told about any trapdoors during her orientation. What was it doing here? Before she could stop herself, she pried it open. The hinges groaned as a faint waft of stale air rose from the dark void below. The flashlight beam barely penetrated the darkness, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the unknown. Against every instinct screaming at her to stop, Emily climbed down. The air grew colder as she descended, her flashlight beam illuminating what appeared to be a small, unfinished basement. The walls were damp, and the floor was covered in dirt and debris. As she swung the beam around, she froze. In the corner of the room was Carl's jacket, crumpled on the ground. Beside it was a dark, wet stain that made her stomach lurch. "Carl?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, only the sound of her own breathing and the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. She stepped closer, the flashlight shaking in her hand. That's when she saw it, scratches on the wall, deep and uneven as if someone had clawed at the concrete in desperation. Beneath the scratches were smears of blood, dried and flaking. A sudden noise behind her made her spin around, the flashlight beam catching a figure standing at the base of the stairs. Emily screamed, dropping the flashlight, and the room plunged into darkness. She scrambled for the stairs, her heart pounding, as heavy footsteps echoed behind her. Something cold and damp brushed against her ankle, and she nearly tripped in her desperation to escape. Bursting back into the storage room, she slammed the trapdoor shut and shoved a heavy shelf over it, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Whatever was down there was pounding against the door now, the sound reverberating through the small room. Emily stumbled back toward the front of the store, tears streaming down her face. When Mr. Porter arrived minutes later, the pounding had stopped. Emily refused to re-enter the storage room, and when the police arrived to investigate, they found the basement empty, no sign of Carl or anyone else. Only the scratches and blood remained, along with a single, chilling detail: the trapdoor had been bolted shut from the inside. Carl was never found. Emily quit the next day, but she would never forget the sound of those footsteps or the cold grip that brushed her ankle in the dark. Story 6. The gas station was quiet, as it usually was during Brandon's night shifts. The hum of the refrigerators, the occasional flicker of the old fluorescent lights, and the rustle of wind against the windows were his only company. It was nearing 2 a.m., and he was scrolling through his phone when the chime of the door startled him. A man walked in. Brandon immediately noticed something was off. The man was pale, his skin almost ghostly under the harsh lights, and his clothes were damp and torn as though he had been caught in a storm, or worse. His disheveled hair clung to his forehead, and his hollow eyes darted around nervously. Yet, he moved with an odd calmness, as if he was used to being out of place. "Excuse me," the man said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can you tell me how to get to Route 27? Brandon hesitated, feeling a strange chill run down his spine. "Route 27? Yeah, it's about 15 miles north. You just take the highway and follow the signs. Shouldn't take you more than 20 minutes. The man nodded but lingered as if he wanted to say more. His lips twitched, but no words came out. He gave a faint, awkward smile, muttered thanks, and turned toward the door. Brandon watched him cross the lot to a battered sedan parked by the far pump. The car was as rough-looking as the man, mud-splattered, one headlight busted, and windows fogged over. The man climbed in, but the engine didn't start. He just sat there. Minutes turned into an hour, and the car didn't move. Brandon grew uneasy. At first, he thought the man might have fallen asleep, but something about the stillness of the car felt wrong. He debated checking but dismissed the idea. The man's frail, uneasy presence still lingered in his mind, setting off warning bells. By 3 a.m., Brandon's nerves got the better of him. Grabbing a flashlight, he stepped outside into the cold night air. The lot was eerily quiet, the light above the far pump flickering. He approached the sedan cautiously, his breath visible in the chill. "Hey, buddy," he called, knocking on the driver's side window. There was no response. The flashlight's beam cut through the fogged glass, revealing an empty seat. The man was gone. Brandon staggered back, his heart pounding. He hadn't seen the man leave. The lot was open, surrounded only by sparse trees and empty fields. There was no way someone could have walked away without him noticing. Yet the car was undeniably empty. Hurrying back inside, Brandon locked the station's doors. His hands shook as he sat behind the counter, staring out at the car. The shadows beyond the pump seemed to shift and move, though he told himself it was just his imagination. Still, every creak of the building made him jump. Around 3:30 a.m., Brandon finally called the police. When they arrived, two officers approached the car, shining flashlights through the windows and running the plates. After a few minutes, one of them walked inside. "This car's been here for days," the officer said grimly. "We've been looking for it." Brandon blinked. "No, that's not possible. The guy driving it came in an hour ago. He asked me for directions to Route 27. The officer frowned. "What did he look like?" Brandon described the man, his pale skin, torn clothes, the way he seemed lost. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "That sounds like the car's owner," he said slowly. "But he's been missing for 3 weeks. His family reported him after he didn't come home from work." A chill ran down Brandon's spine. "I'm telling you, he was here. I talked to him." The officers didn't argue, but their grim expressions said they didn't believe him. They towed the car away, leaving Brandon alone again. But his unease only grew. He couldn't stop replaying the interaction in his mind. The man had been real. Brandon was sure of it, or at least he thought he was. At 5:30 a.m., just as the first light of dawn began to creep into the sky, the door chime rang again. Brandon froze, his heart pounding. The man was back. He stood in the doorway, his pale face expressionless, his clothes still damp and torn. Water dripped onto the floor beneath him. But what truly unsettled Brandon were his eyes, dark, hollow, and unblinking, locked directly on him. "You gave me the wrong directions," the man said, his voice flat and cold. Brandon's breath caught. What? "I told you how to get to Route 27. The man took a step forward, water pooling around his feet. "You didn't help me," he said, his tone colder now. "Now I'm stuck." The air grew heavy and oppressive. The lights flickered, and the shadows seemed to close in around Brandon. He stumbled back, his chest tightening as the man took another step forward. His lips curled into a lifeless smile. "You didn't help me," the man repeated, his voice echoing unnaturally. "And now I'm lost." Story 7. Lily's gas tank beeped angrily as she pulled into the isolated gas station. The night was unnervingly quiet, and the station looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. A single pump flickered under a dim light, the rest of the lot swallowed in shadow. She parked, stepped out, and began filling her tank. The air felt heavy, pressing against her chest as the nozzle clicked into place. That's when she heard it, a faint scraping sound. It was soft like metal dragging across the concrete. She froze, scanning the empty lot. Nothing moved, but the sound persisted, echoing under the car. Her stomach churned as she crouched down to check. Nothing. Just the dark, yawning space under her vehicle. "Get a grip," she muttered, straightening up. She tried to laugh it off, but her hands were trembling as she finished pumping. She climbed into the car and locked the doors, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. Her blood ran cold. A man was crawling out from beneath her car. He was thin and pale, his long limbs unfolding like a spider's. His face was obscured by shadow, but his movements were deliberate, slow as if savoring her terror. Lily's heart pounded. She fumbled with the keys and started the engine, the roar slicing through the silence. The man didn't flinch. He just stood there, his head cocked, staring at her. She hit the gas. The tires screeched as she tore out of the lot. Her hands shook on the wheel, her breath shallow and fast. She glanced in the mirror again, expecting to see the man left far behind. Instead, she saw him standing in the road, a mile ahead, illuminated by her headlights. He was waving. Lily's scream caught in her throat as she swerved past him, the car barely holding its grip on the pavement. She pressed the pedal harder, the speedometer climbing. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the darkness swallowing her whole. Then she heard it. The scraping. This time, it was louder, closer. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from under her car. Tears blurred her vision as she forced herself to look in the mirror. The man's face appeared, upside down, grinning at her through the back window. His mouth stretched impossibly wide, teeth glinting in the dark. The car jerked violently, spinning off the road. Lily's head slammed against the steering wheel, her vision swimming. Through the shattered windshield, she saw him crawling toward her. His grin never wavered. The last thing she heard was the scraping. Then, everything went dark. Story 8-inch. The gas station appeared out of the darkness like a beacon, its flickering neon lights the only sign of life on the desolate highway. Claire's gas light had been on for miles, and her phone's battery had died hours ago. She pulled into the lot, her heart sinking at how empty it was. The surrounding silence was almost suffocating. As she stepped out to pump gas, the chill in the air prickled her skin. She glanced around and froze. Parked near the edge of the lot, partially hidden in the shadows, was an unmarked white van. The engine idled softly, and through the windshield, she saw two men. They weren't talking or moving, they were staring straight at her. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but her tank was nearly empty. She tried to ignore the van, focusing on the gas pump. Her hands shook as she gripped the nozzle, and every second felt like an eternity. She could feel their gaze burning into her. Then the van's engine revved. Her heart skipped a beat as the driver stepped out. He was tall and broad, his face obscured by a hoodie. He leaned against the van, watching her. A moment later, the passenger door opened, and the second man climbed out. Wiry and pale, he moved with a deliberate, unsettling calm. Claire's breath quickened. She pulled the nozzle out, spilling gas in her rush to finish. She shoved it back onto the pump and jumped into her car, locking the doors with trembling hands. Her engine sputtered to life just as the van roared forward, cutting her off at the exit. The driver climbed out and approached her car, motioning for her to roll down the window. "Hey, we're lost. Can you help us?" His voice was calm, almost friendly, but his eyes told a different story. The second man circled her car, peering into the windows. "Go away," she shouted, her voice cracking. She slammed the car into reverse and hit the gas, narrowly missing the circling man. She swung the wheel hard, bouncing over the curb and onto the grass. The car lurched violently, but she didn't stop. She sped onto the highway, her breath coming in ragged gasps. In the rearview mirror, she saw the van's headlights snap on, but they didn't follow. She didn't slow down for miles. When she finally got home, the adrenaline crash hit her hard. Claire locked every door and window in her apartment, then collapsed onto her bed, still shaking. Sleep came in fits, haunted by images of those men in the cold, predatory way they had watched her. The next morning, Claire woke to sunlight streaming through her blinds and a dull ache in her chest. She tried to shake off the memory of the night before, convincing herself it was over. It wasn't until she sat down with her coffee and scrolled through the morning news that her blood turned to ice. 3 young women found dead in nearby town, linked to unmarked white van. The article detailed the gruesome discovery. 3 girls, all missing in the past week, were found in a wooded area miles from the highway. The report described how they had been brutally assaulted and dismembered. Witnesses in the area had reported seeing a suspicious white van with 2 men lingering near gas stations and rest stops. The men hadn't been caught. Claire's coffee cup slipped from her trembling hands, shattering on the floor. Her heart pounded as she read the words over and over, her mind spinning. It was them. The same van. The same men. Her stomach churned as she realized the horrifying truth. If she hadn't escaped, she would have been their next victim. Tears filled her eyes as she thought about the girls who hadn't been so lucky. Her survival felt like a hollow victory. The men were still out there, still hunting, and no one knew when they would strike again. Story 9-inch. The gas station flickered weakly against the oppressive darkness of the highway, its sputtering lights casting jittery, pale beams across the deserted lot. Rick, a truck driver hardened by long, lonely roads, pulled in for a break. The night felt unusually heavy, the air biting cold as he stepped out to refuel. That's when he heard it, a sharp, rhythmic banging from the restroom at the edge of the lot, followed by muffled cries. The sound wasn't natural. It was desperate, human, pleading. Rick froze, his hand still gripping the pump. "Hello?" he called out, his voice uncertain. The banging grew louder, more frantic. "Please, help me. Let me out," the voice cried, trembling with panic. Rick's pulse quickened. He abandoned the pump and approached the restroom, the cold sinking deeper into his skin with every step. "Hang on," he shouted, shaking the locked door. "I'll get you out." The banging intensified, the cries turning raw with urgency. Rick banged on the door himself, yelling, "Hold on, I'm getting help." He rushed into the convenience store, where the attendant lounged behind the counter, his face hollow and disinterested. "Someone's trapped in the restroom." Rick snapped. "You got a key?" The attendant stiffened, his eyes flicking toward the restroom before quickly averting. His expression darkened. "That restroom's been locked for years," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "It's out of order." "What the hell are you talking about?" Rick barked. I heard someone screaming in there. The attendant's face tightened, his eyes heavy with something like fear. You didn't hear anyone. That door's been sealed since something happened. Just leave it alone. Rick's frustration boiled over. Are you seriously telling me to ignore someone begging for help? His voice rose, echoing in the quiet store. It's not someone, the attendant said, his tone grave. And if you know what's good for you, you'll. Before he could finish, Rick stormed behind the counter, snatching the key from its hook. The attendant simply sighed, his face resigned. Don't say I didn't warn you, he muttered as Rick headed back toward the restroom. Rick jammed the key into the lock, twisting hard. The door creaked open, revealing the restroom bathed in the flickering light from the gas station lot. It was empty. Dust blanketed every surface, cobwebs stretched like skeletal fingers across the corners, and the air was stale and heavy, suffocating in its stillness. The mirrors were cracked, the tiles broken and grimy, as though untouched for decades. The cries and banging, gone. The silence felt alive, pressing against his ears. But one thing caught his eye. In the third stall, something foul was smeared across the walls. Dark, sticky patches spread erratically as if someone had detonated a can of paint in a grotesque explosion. The substance had congealed, dripping slowly, staining every surface. The sight turned Rick's stomach. Hello. Rick called out, stepping inside, his voice swallowed by the oppressive stillness. The silence didn't answer. He turned, inspecting every inch of the restroom. There was no one. Just the eerie, decayed remnants of a room left abandoned. But the stall's grotesque mess lingered in his mind, an unspeakable testament to something he didn't want to understand. As Rick stepped out into the lot, his breath hitched. The attendant stood near the door, his expression unnervingly calm. Too calm. It was the kind of look that spoke of resignation, of someone who had seen too much. Satisfied, the attendant asked, his voice flat, almost mocking. There's no one in there. Just an old, filthy bathroom falling apart, Rick snapped, his anger barely masking the unease creeping over him. The attendant didn't flinch. He nodded, stepping forward to close the door. As the lock clicked into place, his voice dropped to a near whisper. Just ignore it, he said. You should leave now. It saw you. Rick froze. The words were like a blade of ice, cutting through the night's chill. The attendant's expression remained unchanged as if he'd uttered the warning too many times to care. Rick didn't argue. He hurried to his truck, fired up the engine, and pulled out of the station. The gas station's dim lights shrank in his rearview mirror, but his heartbeat refused to slow. The banging echoed in his mind, each replay sharper, heavier. And then, suddenly, he heard it again. Help me, the voice was faint, agonized, and this time, it was right next to his ear. His breath hitched as frantic pounding erupted from the windows of his truck, rattling them violently. Rick slammed the brakes, his truck screeching to a halt. He stumbled out, his chest heaving, eyes darting wildly into the darkness. Silence. The banging stopped. The voice was gone. Rick's breath came in ragged gasps as he cautiously approached the truck, scanning its windows. That's when he saw it. Handprints. Dark, wet handprints smeared across the inside of the glass. Rick's blood ran cold. The handprints weren't faint or accidental. They were deliberate, pressed from inside the truck. Storytelling. The clock on the dashboard read 12:47 a.m. as Alan pulled into the nearly empty gas station. The highway was desolate, a black ribbon stretching endlessly into the night. His tank was dangerously low, and this lonely beacon of light was his only option. Alan wasn't a fan of late-night stops, but after hours of driving, he couldn't risk running out of gas in the middle of nowhere. The gas station itself was eerie, dim, flickering lights, cracked asphalt, and a convenience store that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in decades. He parked near the first pump and stepped out, the cold night air biting at his skin. The gas pump beeped loudly as he slid his card in. As he began fueling, Alan noticed the cashier inside the convenience store, a young man in his 20s, acting oddly. The cashier's movements were stiff, almost robotic, as he arranged items on the counter. But it wasn't the awkwardness that caught Alan's attention, it was the way the cashier kept glancing nervously at the security monitor above the register. The cashier's eyes darted to the screen every few seconds, his face pale, his lips moving silently as if he were talking to himself. Alan shrugged it off. It wasn't his business. Maybe the guy was just tired or bored. The pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. Alan replaced the nozzle and walked toward the store to pay. As he opened the glass door, the little bell above it jingled loudly, making the cashier jump. "Evening," Alan said casually. The cashier didn't respond immediately. His eyes flicked to Alan, then back to the security monitor, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. Alan frowned. "Hey, you okay?" "Yeah," the cashier said quickly, his voice strained. He scanned Alan's items, just a bottle of water and a bag of chips, and muttered the total. As Alan handed over his card, he noticed the cashier mouthing something silently again. Alan tilted his head, trying to make out the words, but they were incomprehensible. The young man suddenly fumbled, dropping Alan's receipt to the floor. "Ah, sorry about that," he said loudly, bending down to pick it up. When he stood, he slipped the receipt into Alan's hand, along with something else, a small, crumpled piece of paper. Alan's brow furrowed. The cashier's eyes bore into his, filled with urgency. "Have a good night," he said loudly, his tone almost forced. Alan turned and walked back toward the door, unfolding the note as he went. The handwriting was rushed, almost frantic, but the words were clear: "Don't look back. Someone is hiding by your car." Alan froze, the note trembling in his hand. His heart pounded in his chest, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He wanted to turn around, to confront the cashier, but the words on the note screamed louder in his mind: "Don't look back." His car was just a few feet away, parked under the pale glow of the overhead lights. He forced himself to breathe, his mind racing. Who was hiding by his car? And why? He glanced around the store, spotting a landline phone on the counter. "Hey," Alan whispered, keeping his voice low, "Is this some kind of joke?" The cashier's expression didn't change. His lips barely moved as he whispered back, "Call the cops. Don't go outside." Alan's stomach churned. He nodded, his hands shaking as he grabbed the phone and dialed 911. The ringing seemed to last forever before a calm, professional voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? Alan spoke quickly, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm at a gas station on Route 17. The cashier says someone's hiding by my car. I don't know what's going on. Stay inside, the operator instructed. Officers are on their way. Can you see the person? I haven't looked, Alan said, clutching the phone tighter. The note said not to. The operator asked him to describe his surroundings, keeping him talking to ensure he stayed calm. Alan noticed the cashier had moved closer to the counter, his eyes fixed on the security monitor. They're still there, the cashier whispered. By the back tire. They've been there for 10 minutes. Alan's blood ran cold. He gripped the counter, his legs feeling like jelly. What do they look like? He managed to ask. The cashier shook his head. I can't see them clearly. Just a shadow. Crouched low. Waiting. The minutes stretched into eternity. Alan could hear his pulse in his ears, his breaths shallow and rapid. The store felt like a cage, the fluorescent lights above buzzing like angry insects. Outside, the gas station seemed impossible still, the shadows deeper than before. Finally, red and blue lights flickered in the distance, growing brighter as the sound of sirens pierced the night. 2 patrol cars pulled into the lot, their doors opening in unison. Alan stayed inside as instructed, watching as the officers cautiously approached his vehicle, flashlights slicing through the darkness. One of them motioned for Alan to stay back while the other circled around to the rear of the car. Clear, one of them called out. There's no one here. Alan's knees nearly buckled with relief, but the cashier's face remained tense. Check the cameras, the young man said, his voice trembling now. They were there. I saw them. The officers exchanged a glance before heading inside. Alan followed them to the security monitor, where the cashier rewound the footage. There, the cashier said, pointing at the screen. The black and white footage showed Alan pulling up to the pump, fueling his car, and walking into the store. And then, just as the cashier had described, a figure emerged from the shadows, a hunched shape that crept toward the car and crouched by the back tire. The officers leaned in closer, their faces grim. The figure never moved from its spot, its silhouette unnervingly still. Then, just as the police cars arrived, it melted back into the darkness, vanishing entirely. There's no way they got far, one officer muttered, already heading back outside to search the area. Alan stood frozen, staring at the screen. The figure hadn't looked entirely human. Its proportions were off, arms too long, body too narrow. And the way it moved, it was wrong. Did you see its face? Alan asked the cashier. The young man shook his head. No. But it saw you. The words hit Alan like a punch to the gut. What do you mean? It didn't come here for the car, the cashier said quietly. It came for you. Alan backed away, his heart racing. The officers returned, shaking their heads. Nothing, one of them said. Whoever, or whatever, it was, they're gone. Alan didn't wait to hear more. He thanked the police and bolted to his car, keeping his head on a swivel. The air outside felt heavier now, as though it pressed against him. He unlocked the door, slid inside, and locked it immediately. As he sped away from the gas station, the note still clutched in his hand, Alan couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The night seemed darker, the road stretching endlessly ahead, then, in the rearview mirror, he saw it. A shadow in the back seat.